For nearly 5 years, I worked as a custodian at a middle school, where I was typically on the evening shift. I would arrive at work at around 10 o'clock at night and remain until just before sunrise, when the buses began to arrive. In fact, I enjoyed the job at first. Teachers complaining about things, kids racing down the hallways, or really anyone else. Wasn't anything I had to deal with. I liked being left alone to complete my work, and I wasn't bothered by the silence. However, as time passed, I became aware of how the school felt at night. In contrast to during the day, it felt lifeless, not just quiet. The structure moaned and creaked, as if it were breathing. Additionally, even the slightest sound will make you uneasy when you're the only person around. Your brain would interpret the sound of pipes rattling in the walls, or a locker opening by itself, as footsteps. The basement was one aspect of the school that I never really became accustomed to, but I eventually learned to disregard most of it. The basement extended beneath half of the old school, which was constructed in the 1950s. It wasn't as well finished as the classrooms. Pipes and wires hung overhead in this concrete labyrinth of storage rooms and long, narrow hallways. Old desks filled several of the rooms. Some had old textbooks in boxes. Broken furniture was piled up by others. Down there was usually a musty, wet scent. When the fluorescent lights were on at all, they flickered and buzzed. It was frequently necessary to carry a flashlight in order to see where you were going. One of the senior custodians warned me to stay out of the basement, unless I had to go down there for some reason when I first started. He joked that it was haunted and that it wasn't worth the bother. Even during that first week, I became aware of how uncomfortable I felt in that area of the building, even if I was laughing along. In contrast to the light-filled passageways upstairs, it was like entering another universe. I normally didn't have to go down there, so I tried to avoid it whenever I could. But there were some evenings when I would go past the basement door and get cold simply by looking at it. I had a list of things to do pinned to my cart one evening, perhaps 2 years into my job, and one of them was to bring up a set of folding chairs for a gathering. Since the basement was the only location where the chairs were kept, I moaned as soon as I saw it. I recall arguing for a good minute while standing at the top of the basement stairway door about whether I could ask my supervisor if it could wait until morning, but I didn't want to appear indolent. I took out my flashlight and pushed open the hefty door. Every step I took caused the stairway to reverberate, as if my boots were excessively loud. Only a few of the overhead lights turned on when I reached the bottom and flipped the switch. The majority of the passageway was dark when they exited. It smelled like wet cement down there, I promise. I switched on my flashlight and began to move. The second storage room on the left was where the chairs were intended to be. There were ancient desks stacked to the ceiling in the first room. When I pulled open the second door, which was partially rusted, it squealed like nails on a chalkboard. The smell of wood polish and dust filled the room. The folding chairs were arranged in irregular stacks against the wall. To avoid making as many trips, I knelt and began removing them, attempting to carry as many as I could at once. When I froze, I had just picked up 4. I noticed a faint dragging sound coming from someplace in the corridor, as if someone were gently moving their shoe across the floor. Still hunched over with the chairs in my arms, I listened as intently as I could while holding my breath. The noise ceased. I stood up straight and looked out into the corridor, shining the flashlight in both directions. The glow pierced the darkness, but nothing was seen. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. After what seemed like an eternity, I told myself that it was probably just the pipes, or that perhaps I had moved a chair without noticing. I took the first load outside and headed for the stairs in the corridor. I felt a chilly draft hit my face while I was walking. I had to stop in my tracks, since it was so out of place, because there were no windows or flowing air. The basement was usually heated and stuffy. It was similar to being near an open freezer. I shone my light up and down the corridor, but nothing seemed to have changed. I put the chairs at the bottom of the steps, shook them off, and returned for more. Something didn't feel right when I entered the storage area once more. In some way, the chair stack appeared to have changed while I was away. I scowled at them while attempting to recall their precise lean. I finally picked up another load after telling myself that I was just being paranoid. I heard it again this time as I turned to go, a thump, followed by a scratching noise. It originated in a hallway further down the basement. As I pointed my flashlight in that direction, the beam trembled in my grasp. One of the classroom doors, which ought to have been securely locked, was split open about 20 feet below. I had a stomach drop. I was aware that I had not touched the door. Every night, the school was locked, and I was the only one allowed inside. I stared at the broken door of the storage room as I remained motionless in the entryway. Every aspect of who I am yelled for me to get up and drop the chairs, but I remained still. Perhaps the door had come loose, I said to myself, or perhaps the air pressure had changed when I opened a different door. Those justifications were like a lifeline to me. I swiftly moved the chairs to the stairway and returned empty-handed, holding my flashlight in one hand. The broken door was still there, slightly ajar enough that someone could see inside. My throat became parched. I moved gently in its direction. My footsteps resonated. "Hello? Anyone down here?" I yelled as I got close. In the large, empty basement, my voice broke and sounded tiny. No response. After taking a deep breath, I quickly pulled the door open with my free hand and shone the spotlight inside. Only boxers piled high, cobwebs in the corners, and shells of dusty science equipment occupied the vacant room. With my heart pounding, I briefly entered and listened for any noise. At that moment, I heard the dragging shuffle once more. However, it was in the corridor behind me this time. I turned and aimed a flashlight so that the corridor was cut down by the beam. I sensed it, even though it was nothing more than concrete and shadows. That intense pressure you experience when you are aware that someone is watching you. My entire body prickled. The seats were no longer important to me. With the flashlight pointed down the hallway, I cautiously retreated and headed for the stairway. I picked up the chairs I had left and carried them up the stairs 2 steps at a time. I continued until I was breathing heavily and back in the main hallway upstairs. Despite the temperature in the school, I was perspiring as I rested against the wall. I convinced myself that I was dreaming. I was unable to explain the cracked door, but it might have been rats or water pipes. Despite being told not to, I shut the stairway door behind me and stayed upstairs the remainder of the night. I heard it again a week later, as I was cleaning the hallway directly above the basement stairs. 3 powerful, perfectly spaced bangs that sounded like someone slamming their fist into the wall. Water spilled across the tiles as the mop fell from my grasp. I listened and froze. Then, as if someone had pushed it from the opposite side, I heard the cellar door rattle. My blood froze. I didn't open it. Until the noise ceased, I held on to the mop handle. I wouldn't go down into the basement by myself after that. I would wait till there was another custodian around if something needed to be brought up, since I knew the others would either laugh or claim it was the so-called ghost. I never shared what I had heard with them. However, I am aware of what I heard and felt. Even now, I still get queasy when I remember those sluggish, dragging footsteps following me. For 3 years, I was employed as a high school custodian. Since I was the newest member of the team, I was frequently assigned to overnight shifts with 4 stories and 2 gyms. The structure was enormous. Auditorium felt like a huge maze at night when it was deserted. It was mandatory to lock doors, empty trash, turn off lights, and walk through each floor and room one by one. Typically, it took the entire night to cover everything, and you would miss something if you hurried. I was working alone one Friday night after one of the other custodians called in ill. I wasn't used to being the only person on duty, because we usually worked in pairs. The transition was normal at first. I began by cleaning the halls, wiping off surfaces, and emptying trash cans on the first floor. In some of the older hallways, the lights flickered, causing the shadows to move, but I convinced myself that this was simply the building settling. At about midnight, I ascended to the 3rd level. Since that floor was quieter than the others, I always had a horrible feeling about it. There were numerous outdated classrooms there that were no longer in use. Some were sealed all the time, while others were merely storage spaces containing obsolete scientific equipment, dirty books, and damaged furniture. I passed the lockers as I proceeded down the corridor. I jumped a few times when I heard the mechanical click of the doors and the sound of my boots hitting the tiles. It was natural, I told myself repeatedly. I discovered a door approximately 20 feet away was open. When I was in the middle of mopping one of the main halls, I had already checked every room earlier in the evening and found that every door was closed, so it hit me right away. My initial reaction was to swiftly pass it and disregard it, but I stopped for a reason. I moved slowly, making as little noise as I could, and pressed my mop against the wall. The door had a square glass window and was one of those vintage wooden classroom doors. I cautiously pushed it open and looked inside. Using my flashlight, the room appeared deserted. There were boxers in the corners and desks heaped along the walls. At first look, nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw that one of the boxers by the back wall had been relocated. It had scuff marks on the floor, as if it had been dragged over the tiles, and it was slanted and out of alignment with the others. I felt sick to my stomach. I was aware that I hadn't moved that box, and that I had previously closed that door. I told myself that since I was exhausted, it was probably nothing, and that my imagination was playing tricks on me. I shut the door and resumed scrubbing, but my thoughts kept returning to that chamber. I kept thinking that I needed to look at the windows. The corridor doors and all of the windows were secured from the inside, so perhaps the student had somehow infiltrated. I concentrated on cleaning and attempted to get rid of the feeling that I was being observed. I proceeded to the stairwell to reach the second floor after completing that passageway. My heart almost stopped when I passed the same classroom once more. The door stood ajar. My throat tightened with each breath. I was aware that I had previously shut it. I moved closer, slowly. The room appeared normal when I peered inside, but the box had been shifted to the middle of the floor. My heart was pounding. "Hello, who's in here?" I murmured. In the empty building, my voice sounded small. I waited, but nothing happened. I then heard deep, steady breathing coming from the rear of the room. Not a pipe or a burst of wind. Someone was making sure I could hear them, even though they were attempting to be quiet. I made an effort to persuade myself that the student was concealing something or pulling a practical joke. However, how could they have entered? The only person who was meant to be there was me, and every door was secured. I hurried down the hallway to the stairway after slamming the door. Sweat trickled down my back, and my heart was pounding. Despite the fact that I detested disturbing my boss in the middle of the night, I pushed against the staircase door and listened. I considered phoning him. At last, I did. I tried to speak steadily. As I explained what was going on to him when he picked up, he promised to arrive in 20 minutes. The 20 minutes seemed like hours. I avoided that room as much as I could, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. At last, he came. Together, we ascended once more. With a large flashlight, he entered the classroom right away. The box remained in the center of the floor. We looked everything over. There was nothing behind the desks, beneath the tables, or in the closets. He implied that I was either overtired or having hallucinations. I knew what I had heard, but I didn't dispute it. That heavy, sluggish breathing. I kept looking at that classroom as I attempted to complete my shift with him there. The passageway was more stuffy and chilly than before. I wasn't distracted even by mopping and sweeping. I assumed the locker would swing open each time I passed it. All of the shadows appeared to be people standing just out of sight. When I worked with another custodian a few weeks later, he informed me that a student had been caught hiding in that classroom overnight. Years prior, they had entered covertly to pull a practical joke, but the staff was so alarmed that they never used that room again. Although that made sense, it was insufficient to account for the breathing I heard that evening. The school was empty. My gut knotted every time I considered leaving after finishing the shift. I began to exercise extra caution. As I went by, I checked to make sure every door was secured. If I had to go through that hallway, I would stay close to the stairway and keep my flashlight aimed at the floor. I worked another nighttime shift by myself a few months later. I stayed as far away from that third floor as I could. I moved as fast as I could when I had to get up at last. I kept expecting to hear it once again. The sensation of being observed persisted. I had the impression that people were watching me even though I was in a room at a distance from that classroom. I jumped at every creak on the floor. I swiftly departed after finishing my shift without turning around. I wouldn't work by myself on that floor ever again. I stayed away from it whenever I could, even years later. Whether it had been a student concealing something or something else, I never learned. However, I will always remember the sound of that breathing, emanating from a classroom that ought to have been deserted. Sometimes I can still hear it in my mind. Music for 2 years. I was a night custodian at an old high school. The auditorium was always the worst aspect of the job. It was enormous, with a large stage, 3 levels of seating, and long, bulky curtains that hung from the ceiling. In the daylight, things appeared to be normal. However, when the structure was deserted at night, It was as though one had entered a new universe. Everywhere you looked, even with the lights on, some shadows were darker than they should have been. It transported sound in an odd way. It would be difficult to pinpoint the precise source of the sound if you dropped a broom, since the echo would stretch and bounce. Since I detested going inside the auditorium, I usually kept it for last. My skin always crawled because of something in it. One year, near the end of winter, I had to clean it sooner than normal. Since a play was scheduled for the following morning, I pulled my cart along with me and arrived at around midnight. As I opened the side door, it creaked loudly, and the sound of it slamming behind me reverberated around the deserted room. I began by going around the aisles and between the chairs. Some rows of the chairs were unfastened, while others were antique metal folding seats that were fastened to the floor. I heard the scraping sound bounce off the ceiling and walls as I approached the room. I believed I heard something else after a few minutes had passed. At first, it seemed faint, like a slight rustle coming from the stage. I thought perhaps a prop had fallen over, but when I looked, I saw that the stage was deserted. I told myself it was nothing and shook my head. I carried on, sweeping. After a few minutes, I heard it once more. It was more distinct this time, sound of footsteps moving slowly across the stage. I paused my sweeping and turned to face the stage. The props were placed in the corners, as I could see. The sound sounded real, but nothing moved. I started to breathe shallowly. I shone the flashlight behind the curtains as I made my way slowly up the stairs. Onto the stage, old chairs, ropes, pulleys, and painted scenery were piled up against the walls. Dust coated everything, and my light's beam caused it to appear to be moving. I kept having the impression that someone or something was close by. I retreated from the stage, reasoning that it might just be a rodent in the rafters or the structure settling, but the sensation persisted. I kept scouring the aisles in an effort to get done as quickly as I could. My thoughts kept returning to the stage. Even though I was no longer able to hear those steady footsteps, the sound kept repeating in my mind. I began mopping after completing the lower level sweeping. I believed I saw a shadow move across the second tier of seats as I moved the mop through the rows. I pointed my torch in the direction of the seats, but nothing was visible. I made an effort to convince myself that it was a light prank. I felt as though there was someone behind me as I moved, keeping my back to the wall. I heard it again as I was almost done scrubbing the main floor. Murmur. Although it was low and coming from the balcony seats above me, I was unable to make out any words. Now, my heart was thumping. The beam of my flashlight is shaking in my palms. I didn't run, even though I wanted to. I needed to get the task done. Although I knew I was by myself, I convinced myself it was someone outside or perhaps a janitor who had forgotten something. I continued to mop slowly while straining my ears. The whispering persisted, seemingly becoming closer. I tried calling out, but my voice sounded weak because I was so anxious. There was only the echo and no response of my voice. I began cleaning the stage itself after completing the main floor mopping. Every time I moved my flashlight, I thought I saw something at the very edge of the beam, and the steps up seemed to go on forever. It was occasionally a shadow flicker. There were times when it was only in my head. I peered over the main floor's edge as I arrived at the stage. In the gloom, the seats leaned back. I briefly believed I saw a figure seated on the balcony. When I shone the spotlight there, only a shadow. However, it vanished when I blinked. I convinced myself it was a coat or a chair, but the sensation persisted. I began shifting props and dusting in an attempt to concentrate on something tangible. This time, the whispers were considerably more audible. Nearly exactly behind me, it sounded like someone was calling my name. I whirled around so quickly that I misplaced the torch. There was nobody on stage. Nothing. I knew I hadn't dreamed the voice. Even if the curtains remained in place and the objects were still arranged in the same spot. With my heart pounding, I cautiously retreated and made my way to the side door. I paused and listened at the stage's edge. I could hear gentle footsteps moving across the balcony from the top floors. It was impossible. I told myself. The auditorium had been secured. Nobody else ought to have been present. As if someone were pacing and observing me, the footsteps kept going, pausing and beginning. At last, I sprinted over to the door, grasped the handle, and yanked it open. I was relieved when the chilly night air struck me like a wall, but I could still hear the faint echo of footfalls above. which gradually faded away. I was having so much trouble locking the door behind me because my hands were shaking so much. I felt the perspiration trickle down my brow as I leaned against it to catch my breath. But that evening, I stayed outside. When I attempted to explain what had happened to another custodian the following morning, he smiled and remarked, "It's an old building and probably just settles or something." However, I'm not persuaded. My name being spoken so quietly and purposefully, that whispering voice, and the footsteps pacing overhead, I sensed them in the atmosphere. A few weeks later, I discovered that a drama instructor had unexpectedly passed away in that theater when rehearsal was taking place years prior. Heart attack in front of the pupils on stage. People claimed that occasionally they could still hear him whispering in the seats or wandering the stage at night. I tried telling myself it was only a story and that the noises were typical for an old building, but I would never be able to forget the way my name was spoken and the sound of footsteps. Perhaps I was losing my mind. I'm not sure. I declined to clean the auditorium after that night. Not long after, I resigned from that position. However, there were moments when I felt the same chill pressure in the auditorium and the same sense of being watched, even though there were other individuals within the building. I am certain that what I went through was real. At least schizophrenic episodes or anything similar have never happened to me. Therefore, I'm still completely perplexed by this.